is 356 BC, the year of Alexander's birth. In an area of northern Greece known as Macedonia, or Macedon, King Philip II rules a population that other Greeks consider inferior.
We get this impression that the Macedonians are barely literate, that they are boorish, that they are beneath the high level of culture that is exhibited by many Athenians, and furthermore that they're dangerous, as represented by the king, Philip II.
But the Macedonians are very wealthy. They control areas filled with gold and silver mines. Philip exploits these riches to the fullest. He assembles, trains, and equips an army that is one of the finest in the world. At the time of Alexander the Great's birth in 356 BC, the troops of Philip II are engaged in expanding his kingdom. Two cities in the Macedonian region of northern Greece are prominent. Aegae, now called Vergina, is the first Macedonian capital and continues to be an active place of ancestral worship, politics, and art. Remains of a large palace still exist, as well as an outdoor theater where celebrations, performances, and athletic competitions are held. In the 4th century BC, Pella becomes the active Macedonian capital and home of King Philip II. This is where Alexander the Great grows up. He lives a life of royalty, but he is by no means a spoiled rich kid. His ambition and curiosity about the world are limitless.
Alexander is a boy of incredible intellect. His favorite author is Homer, and he regularly sleeps with a copy of Homer's poems by his bedside. At Pella, he is educated in a school reserved for the children of Macedonian nobility. At this academy, he's given the finest training, academic, athletic, and military. But at the age of 13, an event occurs which convinces Philip that his son's intelligence is only surpassed by his courage.
There came a day when Philonicus the Thessalian brought Philip a horse named Bucephalus, which he offered to sell for 13 talents. The king and his friends went down to the plain to watch the horse's trials, and came to the conclusion that he was wild and unmanageable. Philip ordered it to be led away. But Alexander, who was standing close by, remarked, "What a horse they're losing, and all because they do not know how to handle him or dare not try." Alexander went quickly up to Bucephalus, took hold of his bridle, and turned him towards the sun, for he had noticed that the horse was shying at the sight of his own shadow. Alexander vaulted safely on his back. He urged him forward, using a commanding voice and a touch of the foot. At first, Philip and his friends held their breath and looked on in an agony of surprise until they saw Alexander ride back triumphant. His father, we're told, actually wept for joy. When Alexander had dismounted, he kissed him and said, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you."
Whether fact or fiction, legend has it that Bucephalus becomes Alexander's favorite horse, one he ultimately rides into battle for years to come.
King Philip is so impressed with his son, he decides that the teachers at the Macedonian court do not provide him with the intellectual challenge he deserves. Philip brings in a new tutor, a man who has gone down in history as one of the most influential thinkers in the world, Aristotle. Aristotle was one of the widest-ranging minds that ever lived. A philosopher whose teachings covered ethics, politics, music, medicine, embryology, astronomy, botany, magnets, optics, history, zoology, rhetoric, poetry, and most important, curiosity. He teaches Alexander to make no assumptions. Every situation is different. Organize, analyze the facts before drawing conclusions.
Add this to Alexander's natural spontaneity and you have a recipe for genius.
340 BC, King Philip II of Macedon, father of 16-year-old Alexander, is at war. His goal, to control Greece. By the time Alexander turns 16, Philip controls most of Greece. But when news of each additional triumph reaches Alexander, he shows no pride.
Whenever he heard that Philip had captured some famous city or won an overwhelming victory, Alexander would show no pleasure at the news, but would declare to his friends, "Boys, my father will forestall me in everything. There will be nothing great or spectacular for you and for me to show to the world." Alexander had no desire to inherit a kingdom which offered him riches, luxuries, and the pleasure of the senses. His choice was a life of struggle, of wars, and of unrelenting ambition.
In August 338 BC, the day arrives for the battle at Chaeronea to take place. Alexander is 18. Philip decides it is time for his son to become a Macedonian commander. He places him in charge of the companion cavalry, a force of 2,000 horsemen who always perform a key strategic role in Philip's battles, attacking the enemy from a flank position. It is with the battle at Chaeronea that the historian Diodorus begins his accounts of Alexander's life.
The armies deployed at dawn, and the king stationed his son Alexander, young in age, but noted for his valor and swiftness of action, on one wing, placing beside him his most seasoned generals, while he himself, at the head of picked men, exercised the command over the other. Individual units were stationed where the occasion required. On the other side, dividing the line according to nationality, the Athenians assigned one wing to the Thebans, and kept command of the others themselves.
Following the bloody battle in August 338 BC, the fields of Chaeronea are filled with carnage. Philip, with the aid of his son, achieves his goal of controlling Greece. It's a happy occasion for all, except one man, Pausanias, a royal bodyguard. According to the ancient historian Diodorus, Pausanias is beloved by Philip because of his beauty. But when the king becomes enamored of another young man, Pausanias reacts poorly. He accuses the young man of being a promiscuous hermaphrodite. For this, Pausanias is punished. He is plied with wine until drunk. Unconscious, he is thrown to the king's mule drivers to abuse in drunken licentiousness. Later he complains to Philip about this abuse, but the king takes no action against those responsible. In anger, Pausanias runs up to Philip, stabs him, and runs off. But he is killed before making his escape. Alexander rushes to his father, but it's too late. Philip dies in 336 BC. Alexander, at age 20, becomes king and wastes no time asserting his authority. King Alexander then turns his attention toward what would become his life's goal, the conquest of Persia. Alexander is accompanied by his own trusted advisors, military commander Parmenio, his close friend Hephaestion, and Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle, who serves as Alexander's personal historian. On the high opposite bank of the Granicus River, the Persian army waits, with 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry, many of them Greek mercenaries. Greek author and General Arrian wrote about Alexander's first test of will.
Parmenio came to Alexander and argued, "We cannot take the army across the river on a broad front. A failure in our first action will at once have serious consequences and will put at risk the result of the whole war." Alexander replied, "I know that, Parmenio, but I would be ashamed if I could cross the Hellespont easily and then found that this little stream could prevent us from crossing. It does not fit in with the way I react when I meet danger."
Alexander proceeds to organize his army for a bold attack, one that many military leaders might consider foolhardy. Alexander plays a key role in the offensive, brazenly wearing a white-plumed helmet, marking him as the prime target of every enemy soldier. Alexander's battle strategy at the river Granicus utilizes tactics he learned from his father. Thousands of highly trained soldiers on foot and horseback would boldly cross the river and meet the Persians head-on. Against all odds, Alexander defeats the Persian army at Granicus.
This was perhaps the greatest stroke that Alexander could have hoped for, because when the enemy withdrew from the field, he had achieved everything that he wanted to achieve, which was to say, basically, "You've totally underestimated me, and I'm going to whip your butt."
Alexander's victory at Granicus allows his army to continue its invasion of Persia. General Memnon survives the battle and reports to Persian King Darius, who determines that the next time the two forces meet, he personally will command the Persian troops. Darius's troops have been estimated to number 600,000, but most historians agree that 60 to 100,000 is far more likely. Nevertheless, Alexander's troops, 30 to 40,000 strong, are severely outnumbered. Darius is confident that the Persian army under his personal command will defeat Alexander. But to give himself even greater advantage, Darius makes a strategic move that takes Alexander by surprise. The Macedonians anticipate Darius attacking from the south. Alexander moves his forces south from his Issus base camp to await the Persian army. But then, Alexander receives startling news. Undetected, Darius moves his army north through a mountain pass and captures Issus, severing Alexander's supply lines. Darius is now preparing to attack from the north. Alexander has no choice but to reverse his direction. The Battle of Issus in November of 333 BC is critical to Alexander's conquest of Asia, but his army is outnumbered by the forces of Persian King Darius. Rough ground hinders the progress of the legendary Macedonian phalanx and infantry, which find themselves engaged in the bloodiest of hand-to-hand combat. The only chance for Macedonian victory lies with the cavalry, led by Alexander himself.
Alexander was as much a soldier as a commander. Riding high in his chariot, Darius cut a conspicuous figure. His brother Oxatheres saw Alexander bearing down on Darius and moved the cavalry under his command right in front of the king's chariot. Then the carnage truly took on cataclysmic proportions. Around Darius's chariot lay his most famous generals who had succumbed to a glorious death before the eyes of their king, and who now all lay where they had been fighting.
Persian King Darius begins to panic, but the battle is far from over. Alexander turns his attention to his bloodied and beaten phalanx and infantry still bravely trying to hold their ground.
At this point, Alexander alone holds the key to victory or defeat. The usual problem with cavalry is that once you let it go, it's gone. That infantry running away there is a perfect target for cavalry, and just beyond them is the Persian camp with all its loot. But Alexander has sufficient command to stop his cavalry charge, and the control to regroup them, turn them left, and smash into the Persian center. Here, Darius himself is directly attacked by Alexander. Too late, Darius discovers that the Macedonians' strongest force is their cavalry. In the savage fighting that follows, Alexander himself is wounded in the thigh. Darius, as he sees his royal bodyguard being cut to pieces, turns his chariot round and runs for his life. The Persian line folds up, and as evening falls, their retreat becomes a rout.
Following this battle in late 333 BC, Alexander confidently leads his army into Egypt. There, he is given the title of Pharaoh, by tradition making him both a king and a son of Ra, or God. After traveling through Heliopolis and Memphis, Alexander comes upon a shoreline so magnificent, he envisions a grand seaport.
Alexandria is the first of more than 30 cities founded by Alexander in his own name. But why here? Well, it's an excellent location between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean Sea. It has a mild, healthy climate and an excellent natural harbour, deep and well sheltered, further improved when Alexander commands the offshore island of Pharos to be connected to the mainland by a mole.
By the summer of 330 BC, there is little doubt, at least in Alexander's mind, that he rules Asia. But it isn't enough for Alexander to control Darius's kingdom. He passionately continues to pursue Darius, not to kill him, but to take him prisoner. When Alexander learns Darius is heading north, he again takes up the chase.
So rapid was the march that many of the men, unable to stand the pace, dropped out. A number of horses were worked to death, but Alexander pressed on, regardless of loss. At this juncture, two important persons in Darius's army sought an interview with Alexander. They reported that Darius had been forcibly seized and put under arrest by his own commanders. Bessus, one of his generals, had assumed power in his place. Instantly, Alexander was on the march again, with greater rapidity than ever.
June 330 BC. Alexander's army marches day and night to catch up with the Persian army under the control of Bessus. Within 2 weeks, Alexander has the Persian troops in sight. Even though the Persian army is still far greater in number than that of Alexander, thousands of Persian soldiers surrender. Bessus, however, would not allow such a fate for Darius.
Bessus and his fellow conspirators came to Darius's wagon and started urging him to mount a horse and flee to escape his enemy. Darius, however, declared that the gods had come to avenge him and, calling for Alexander's protection, refused to go along with the traitors. At this they were furious. They hurled their spears at the king and left him there, run through many times.
With the great and powerful Darius lying severely wounded, only time would dictate whether Alexander would be able to capture him alive. When Alexander's forces finally catch up to the fleeing Persian troops, they find Darius barely clinging to life.
They found him at his last gasp. He asked for a drink, and he swallowed some cold water, which a Macedonian brought him. He said, "This is the final stroke of misfortune, that I should accept a service from you and not be able to return it. But Alexander will reward you for your kindness, and the gods will repay him for his courtesy towards my mother and my wife and my children." As he said this, he took the Macedonian by the hand and died. When Alexander came up, he showed his grief and distress at the king's death, and unfastening his own cloak, he threw it over the body and covered it.
With Darius dead, Alexander's conquest will ultimately be assured. But in the ensuing months, Alexander faces new enemies within his own army and within himself. In July of 324 BC, Alexander suffers an even deeper hurt. His close friend Hephaestion dies of an unknown illness. Alexander is devastated.
We are told that Alexander flung himself on the body of his friend and lay there nearly all day long in tears and refused to be parted from him until he was dragged away. Some have said that he had Hephaestion's doctor hanged for giving the wrong medicine. All the accounts agree that for 2 whole days after Hephaestion's death, Alexander tasted no food and paid no attention in any way to his bodily needs, but lay on his bed, crying.
I think Hephaestion, because of his close personal relationship with Alexander, was one of these confidants. And when Alexander lost him, he lost a very, very close ally in developing policy. And you might even say that he begins to go downhill after Hephaestion's death. That he shows signs of losing some will after Hephaestion's death.
Less than 1 year after Hephaestion dies, Alexander rests in Babylon, planning a possible conquest of Arabia, when he too becomes ill. During a 10-day period, what begins as a mild fever evolves into a mysterious, life-threatening illness.
Late in the evening of June the 9th, 323 BC, a group of Alexander's officers keep vigil as their king's condition worsens. He tells them, "I foresee a great funeral battle over me." Towards the end, they gather round his bedside to ask the critical question, to whom will he bequeath his kingdom? Weakly, Alexander whispers his last words, "Kratisto," to the strongest. Early in the morning of June the 10th, his eyes close forever.
For centuries, historians have debated the cause of Alexander's death, from alcoholism to poisoning to compulsive self-destruction. The death of Alexander the Great brings to a close a conquest never again equaled by any warrior at any time in history. The statistics alone are staggering. One man leading 40,000 soldiers by foot and horseback, more than 20,000 miles over 12 years. The vast kingdom which Alexander fought so hard to build over a 12-year period ultimately becomes divided among more than 20 rulers.
Today, historians, scholars and soldiers continue to debate the complex character of King Alexander of Macedon. Why do we call him Alexander the Great? Most agree he was the finest military commander that ever lived. He also created a cultural exchange between East and West that became a pivotal point in human history. But he gained his empire at a huge cost of death and destruction. If he had lived, how much further would he have gone? Perhaps we are fortunate that we will never know. At the end of his short life, Alexander was walking a fine line between genius and insanity.
Alexander gives an example to the world of a general, the likes of which we have never seen since. Every major general compares himself to Alexander, and I think most every major general feels that somehow he falls short of Alexander.
Alexander himself was so powerful a figure that during his lifetime, men who afterwards became great kings, marshals, and leaders, while he lived, they were no more than senior officers, lions to his lion tamer. And even after his death, they were still so scared of him that in council meetings, his crown, his scepter, his royal robe presided at the head of the table. He was still there for them, even though he was dead.
Alexander appears to have had not one moment of self-doubt, not one moment of fear. Whether he was a god or not, he certainly had the confidence of one. He had an absolute vision of his own greatness, and in the end, we are forced to agree with him. He is, and will always remain, Alexander the Great.